Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Great Problems, Great Minds seminar. I'm very pleased. My name is Matt Shapiro. I'm a professor of political science in the Department of Social Sciences, and I'm very pleased to have join us today Professor Libby Hemphill from the University of Michigan. Let me read her bio. First of all, Professor Hemphill and I met while she was a professor here at IIT, so it's great to have her return and present some of her research. Now, however, she is associate professor at the School of Information and Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan, and she's also a research associate professor at the Institute for Social Research, both at the University of Michigan. She is the director of the Resource Center for Minority Data, a director of Social Media Archive at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, which is a great place to work on your methods, right? Right, Libby? Okay.
Yes, it is.
And she's an associate director at the Center for Social Media Research. I don't think I need to say much more than that, except for the fact that she's also just a wonderful collaborator. And I've enjoyed a lot working with her and talking about some of these very difficult problems that are both online and offline based, although clearly Professor Hemphill's interests are what's going on online foremost. With that, I'm going to turn everything over to you. Please go for it. And as I emailed you, maybe go for roughly 30, 40 minutes at the most, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I really loved being at Illinois Tech, and I am glad to come back even virtually. I recognize some of the names and faces that are showing up, and some are new, but hello. Today I'm going to talk about a study that I did about the sort of social media data and whether or not people think it's sensitive and whether or not it's okay for us to use it when we do research. And I try to put the takeaways in the titles so that you can find them. And here it is, basically that respondents to our survey said that social media data was more sensitive than their weight and less sensitive than their driver's license number. And we're going to talk about sort of how does that compare to other data about people and why do we care about it in the first place? Let's see. Okay, so if I click through here, you all now see it says research goals and there's some lists.
Yep.
Okay, so we wanted to understand what was an appropriate way to use sensitive data so that we could design restricted access systems and a social media archive. So in Matt's intro, he listed a bunch of the titles that I have. The one that I guess the two that are most related to this work are associate professor in the School of Information and the director of the social media archive. So I have research functions and administrative functions. And building a social media archive requires that our goal is to sort of make it possible for more people to do research with social media data. But we also recognize that social media data, so I'm thinking of things like tweets or Facebook posts or Reddit comments, that they are generated by people who don't generate them as research data. They're generating them for some other need. And so it's not just a straightforward, like pull it into the archive and let's use it for research, because we have different ethic guidelines about how we ought to treat data generated by humans. So we had four main goals in this project. First, we wanted to articulate how the expectations that people have and their impressions of personal information relate to who is using the data. So do they feel differently about social media platforms using data than they do about researchers, for instance? Second, we wanted to measure how their expectations and impressions about social media data differ from other types of sensitive data, where sensitive data is stuff that we might want to keep to ourselves or to a small restricted group of people, like weight and driver's license number. And then we wanted to know whether there are any differences in the demographic groups that care about these things, like I'm a queer woman, do I care about my social media data differently than a cis guy might, cis straight guy? That's something that we wanted to understand so that we could make sure to serve different constituencies effectively. And then last, we wanted to know whether we could replicate findings because there are a couple of other studies about social media and personally identifiable information. But given that it's a relatively new space, we have 3 or 4 one-offs, but we don't have any replications. We wanted to know, do respondents in our sample give the same answers as other samples? So those are the goals of the project. Which thing do I click? There we go. How did we operationalize these into variables? So our main dependent variable is a binary variable. That's actually, I've misphrased it here. It doesn't read binary, but it was binary. Is it okay for an entity to use a particular type of data for a specific purpose? And then our independent variables, we vary the entity, the data, and the purpose. So we use all of these combinations. So for instance, we asked individuals, is it okay for a social media platform to use your location to serve you ads? So that's a combination of the entity, the data, and the purpose. And then we used some controls that we thought would impact how people felt about their data. Basically, do they trust institutions? How do they think about governance? Do they already actively work to protect their own privacy online? And then their sort of general risk aversion. And then because we're social scientists and we think that politics and demographics drive a lot of things, we included those. And then for people who are actually active on social media, we wondered whether the social media they use and how they understand the rules of that place impact how they think about whether or not we could use data for research. So as I mentioned, there are existing surveys that have done this. And so we wanted to build on those, and we built on 4 different types. So I guess since I can use annotate, since I don't have let's see. So first, these are studies from social media and marketing about whether it's okay for particular entities to use data for purposes. So for instance, I might go a little annotation crazy. So this one was about Twitter research ethics. So this is, can you use tweets in data or in survey research? The Milna paper, this is the consumers perceive in personal data sharing. This is with marketers. So how do people feel about that? And then this last paper was about location specifically. And so we used items from those surveys in our instrument. And we also used existing trust in institution, privacy, and social media use questions from surveys like the General Social Survey, these existing privacy surveys, and then the Pew Research Center runs sort of a series about social media use, and we adapted measures and questions from each of those existing surveys. Oh, where was my? Well, we'll go back. I put my slides in the wrong order. So as I mentioned, we adapted these existing surveys. We also, Michigan has a consulting group called the Statistical Design Group that is survey methodologists and their students. And you can go present to them and say, help me with my survey instrument to make sure that you're methodologically sound. And so we presented to them and they helped us come up with an instrument that would give us reliable and valid data without making our respondents tired or angry. And so I highly recommend working with methodologists when possible. And the people who we surveyed were 586 panelists through a Qualtrics panel where we paid Qualtrics to find people, and then 432 crowd workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And we ran this in 2 different recruitment strategies because the prior surveys about social media use and data all used M-Turkers, but we know that Mechanical Turkers do not represent the demographics of social media users or of Americans. And so we wanted 2 different panels so that we could figure out how different is a population sample, which is what the Qualtrics group is, from a convenience sample, which is what the M-Turk group is. And then we use 3 different types of mixed effects models to understand relationships between those independent variables and the outcome variable of, is it okay for this entity to use this data for this purpose? So let's go back for a minute and talk about the sort of what's the baseline from existing research. So this is from the Fiesler and Poferis paper about Twitter data. And here they found that people were somewhat comfortable or neither uncomfortable or not with the idea of that their tweets would be used in research, but that they'd mostly feel comfortable about that. But there's a sizable portion of people who are under somewhat uncomfortable or very uncomfortable, especially if their whole tweet histories get used in research. How many of you are currently active on Twitter? If you can raise your Zoom hands, that would be great. Just a couple. Okay. How many of you are active on social media that's not Twitter? Still just, okay, there are a few hands. Anybody want to venture a guess at what the rules are from the platform about what happens to your data? You can tell us which platform and what you think the rules are. Go ahead, Herbert. You can I clicked ask to unmute. We'll see if that works.
I am sorry, can you repeat your question again, please?
Yeah, what social media platform do you use, and what do you think the rules are about how your data can get used?
I'm more likely to use, WeChat, which is kind of the Chinese version of Twitter or a Facebook Messenger.
Yeah. And what do you think the rules are about who can use your WeChat messages?
I guess most of the data were owned by the company.
Mm-hmm.
And if I give the permission to share, for example, my location or my contents, like my conversation with my friends, I guess it's automatically collected by the company.
It is. And then the company, WeChat doesn't have thank you for answering. WeChat doesn't have a reliable API, application programming interface, that lets us automatically collect WeChat data. But if you're posting in public places, we can scrape sort of with a bot, we can scrape WeChat to collect data, and there aren't actionable prohibitions on using that data in research. It also, because WeChat is owned by a Chinese company, there are different rules about what the Chinese government can demand of the company. US government or US companies are also subject to the US government, but the rules about what the US government is allowed to ask them are more clear than the rules about what the Chinese government is allowed to ask of Chinese companies. You might hear this come up in the TikTok ban debates in the US, that it's really about what can state actors do with data. Matt has his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, would that differ between European users with the general data protections regulation?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are they able to use the data exactly the same way so long as they've signed on, or if they haven't signed on to allow those data to be collected, they can't be used then? Is that right?
So there are a couple of things with GDPR. So one is that it's not Europeans, it's data generated in Europe, which was a distinction I didn't understand. So like if I go on vacation, I'm supposed to go to Germany in October for a meeting. If I generate social media data while I'm in Germany for that meeting, that data is subject to GDPR, even though I am a US citizen. And if my colleague, I have a colleague who's German who works in the US, when he generates data here in the US, it is not subject to GDPR, even though he is a European citizen. So it's about where was the data generated. And then the second is that what matters for GDPR is the right to be forgotten. So GDPR does not prohibit us from using the APIs and existing terms of service that platforms make you agree to when you sign up for the API. And it doesn't have prohibitions against using publicly available data, where publicly available means I can get it without an API. But it does mean that if I have data that someone has requested be deleted, I'm supposed to delete it. And platforms, like if you're using an API, it's easier to do that because the API will tell you what you're supposed to delete. But we haven't had any case law yet to tell us sort of how hard are we supposed to work to figure out if something has been deleted. We're the we as researchers, because there's also a carve out in GDPR for research. But what constitutes research and who constitutes a researcher have also not yet been codified through legislation or case law. Yeah. Okay, so the second one, if you're on your laptop, you should be able to zoom in, but really I'm just going to talk about 2 points. So this is from that paper that I mentioned about what information are people willing to share with advertisers or marketers. And the ones I want to highlight are this one here, which is passwords, and this one down here, which is gender. And then in the middle, we have online screen name. And what these are showing us are what are the types of risk that people thought sharing that data carried. And so they are psychological, social, monetary, and physical risk. So the survey asked them, you know, how risky is it to share this data with marketers? And what I'm showing you here is that they're pretty nervous about sharing passwords and social security numbers, medical history. They don't think there are many risks to sharing gender or country of citizenship. And somewhere in the middle is online screen name, which is close to your contact information at work. So these are just like relative risk of sharing information. So those are sort of where we're coming from, that people think of existing work says that people think of their online data as sort of moderately risky to share, and they don't want you to use all of it in research without asking them. Those are essentially the baseline that we were working from. Okay, and then we did methods. So what do we find? Well, who did we survey? So we roughly balanced between men and women, and then we tried to oversample for everybody in this is eligible to work in America. We tried to oversample for Black Americans because they're often excluded from these surveys, but it's very difficult to achieve measurable numbers of marginalized populations. So we got to 9%, which is lower than the US, but higher than the previous studies. And then we sort of have some relatively even distributions across age, education, income, et cetera. So those are the basic demographics for the people we surveyed. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Do those hold across both of your panels?
This is if we put everybody together. Yes.
So if you separate them out, is this still kind of how it looks?
MTurk is a little bit whiter and manlier.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so in the first model, this is supposed to, it's supposed to say reference category. I don't know why it's not showing up. So I'm showing you odds ratios here. In each case, the reference category is online screen name. So relative to online screen name, how sensitive is driver's license number? So it's over 4 times more sensitive than your online screen name. We found that people who were recruited through Qualtrics thought it was more sensitive than people recruited through MTurk. So the Qualtrics panelists generally were more concerned about sharing than the MTurkers, which means that I think these previous studies that use only MTurk are less conservative measures than our study because we have this Qualtrics panel. And so these, for odds ratios, if it's less than 1, it means it's less sensitive than online screen name. If it's more than 1, it means it's more sensitive. So the only things less sensitive were weight, religion, race, and height. So these are personal characteristics of a person. They were less sensitive. Things that were more sensitive are identifiers: fingerprint, your family, your driver's license number, these other sorts of identifiers. And we saw some differences along demographics, but all of these are, I mean, they matter a little bit, but they're not huge, is sort of how I read those odds ratios for demographics. And then we see, not surprisingly, when we control for whether or not people trust institutions and their digital privacy concerns and whether or not they use privacy protecting behaviors, then we get a little bit of difference when we control for those things. So this is our main, this is what I put in the title, right? It's more sensitive than an individual characteristic and less sensitive than an individual identifier, basically. And the reason that we used these data types is that these data types are keys to other information about people, like their voter registration number, or they are commonly used in research. So we're trying to get a sense of sort of how different is social media data from other types of data. And the reason we want to do that is that we have pretty well established archiving ethic and technical infrastructures for dealing with types of data like weight and driver's license number. So what we need to figure out for social media data is which of these is it more like, so that we can build the right infrastructure and social policies around using the data. Come back. Okay. Here is violin plots about the sensitivity of the things that we asked. And the reason that I show these and not just odds ratios is to show how much variation there is among the respondents, where when you see something that's sort of wider, like these here, most people said their mother's maiden name, their mental health, their medical history, and their license plate number were sensitive, where the ones that are sort of flat, like religion and weight, we had more variance in that distribution. That's what the violin plot is showing us. And similarly, we see that online screen name, which is down here, is pretty flat. So there's a lot of variance in how people are going to answer this. And this gives us sort of a different look at the same information as the table before this, that, the table before is on average. And then this shows us like, well, how average is average? And for online screen name, it's not very. So there's something about the context or the individuals that tell us whether or not they actually think that data is sensitive. And we didn't have enough questions in this survey to answer all of that. So that's sort of a future work issue. Okay, I go next. We also looked at, so that was like data itself. And then this is data and its use purpose. And again, these are odds ratios and the stars indicate their statistical significance, but really, the odds ratio sort of tells you how significant it is by its size. And this is researchers in the second column, journalists in the third column, and social media companies in the last column. And what this shows us is generally people they don't want journalists to have their data. They're relatively comfortable with researchers having their data and with social media platforms, and less so with journalists across the board, sort of no matter what people are going to do with the data. The one that I thought was the sort of most surprising is actually this one, that people were not comfortable with anyone making a map of peonies based on their social media images. And so I thought map of peonies was a pretty innocuous product, but there was something about using images and location that made people be like, even if you're going to build an innocuous product with it, I don't want you to use my data to do it. And so thinking about sort of what does this mean for citizen science and sort of distributed sensors of the natural environment that people want to be included in those decisions was sort of what I took from this. Okay. And then these are plots that are easier to read than those tables that show, and here the reference categories are social research, your social media posts, and by academic researchers, and that all these odds ratios are less than 1 or they overlap 1, shows us that in all of these cases, they're less comfortable with that than they are with social research by academic researchers. So again, researchers come out pretty trusted compared to the other data users and data types. And I can come back to any of these, but I wanted to get to the end on time. So main takeaways, people were generally okay with their social media data being used for social research. It was more sensitive than personal characteristics, less so than personal identifiers. And what does that mean for us as researchers? Our team just thinks that it means that we need to communicate the who, why, and which data when we're talking about our work, that we have an obligation to those whose data we are using to communicate with them about whose data we're going to use, why we need it, and specifically which data is it, and that's what we owe individuals. Because the people who are posting on social media don't actually owe researchers anything. So we're thinking about, what do researchers owe them? I'm happy to follow up. You can reach me via email. I used to tweet my handle on there too, but I took Twitter off my phone. So you're probably not going to find me on Twitter lately. And then the paper is available, open access from Scientific Data at that DOI. Boom, on time. Thank you.
You didn't have to, you could have gone a little longer. That was awesome. Thank you very much for presenting the nuts and bolts of your project. All right, this is the time for Q&A. I have a few questions, but I'd very much like to hear from our patient audience. Does anyone out there want to ask a question of Professor Hemphill? Anything, any clarifying questions? If you wanted to go back and explain one of the tables.
I'll take adjacent questions too. I see we talked to them. Did you delete any other social? I did, Braden. I took Facebook off too. I went on vacation a couple of weeks ago and I didn't have internet. And so I took Twitter and Facebook off my phone and I haven't put them back on, but I still have Reddit and Instagram. Have I ever downloaded TikTok? That's a good question. I don't think so. I'm looking to see. No, yeah, I do have TikTok. I've never used it. Mostly though, I don't use TikTok because I have a 9-year-old boy who's very interested in gaming and social media. And part of my job as his parent is to keep him off things that are dangerous for him. So it's kind of like, if you don't have it in the house, you won't eat it. If I don't have it on my devices, he won't watch it.
Anyone else want to ask? Oh, great.
For US data. So good question. I think that, so there are 4 bills that have already been introduced somewhere in the federal legislation. None of them are going to move in the next 2 years because they don't have any Republican co-sponsors. I don't think that we're going to see GDPR-like legislation at the federal level for at least 4 years, because I don't think it's a priority, even if the Democrats take the House in 2024. And that's a pretty big if. It's not a priority for Republicans, and so it won't be a priority at the federal level. What we are seeing is states making decisions. So in Illinois, for instance, you have a biometrics data protection that's not available to everybody outside Illinois. California and New York have protections. Massachusetts has protections. And then there are places like Texas and Florida who don't want any protections and have legislated in the opposite way. So I think that we are not likely to have federal legislation until we have Democratic control of both the House and the Senate, because it's not going to get Republican support. And I don't think that the states are going to agree. But because we don't have federal legislation about it, it's also not going to come before the courts in the next couple of years. And so, no, I don't see that happening in the US in the next 4 years. Representative Trahan from Massachusetts is the one to watch. She is the most active in this space.
Libby, thank you for your great talk. So my question is, I'm wondering, like, actually, when we sign up for this social media, usually we will sign up is like terms of service. So
Mhm.
it's kind of a long page, usually it's long page terms to actually talk about how this data will be used, but actually people may not read the data carefully. So it's possible like for these kind of terms of service, it can be like more more easily for the readers to understand what their data will be used.
So I think there is one of the bills that's moving, and it's related to the kids online safety bill, which I don't actually support the kids online safety bill because I think it's dangerous for queer kids, but there is a bill that's attached. I'm gonna have to think about who wrote it, but it has a sort of human readable TOS legislation, where TOS is terms of service. So that one might move. But I think that the challenge really is that you don't get to decide what the terms are, even if you understand them. And so I'm highlighting this Fiesler and Poferis paper because this one talks about how Twitter users don't actually know what the terms are. So there's the question about whether or not you understand the terms, which there is a like nutrition label essentially for social media bill that is in committee right now. But the second challenge is, even if you understand it, it's not like you can opt out and still use the service. And so if we're relying on things like Twitter for news or Facebook for social support, that we have to weigh as users whether the benefits of that platform outweigh the risks that we are required to take on when we sign a terms of service. So I think we have two challenges to solve. One is, can people understand it? And then two, what should they be?
So for currently, all these social media companies, they don't give you the options what actually use. It's all like a uniform the terms of service.
Yeah, basically. I mean, you can set some sort of privacy settings, but privacy settings and term settings are not the same. So the company will always have access to your data, whether you make it private to me or not.
Okay, I see. That's how currently we have this kind of user distributed structure social media.
Well, and then in thinking about this has been a challenge for Mastodon, for instance. So Mastodon is a distributed social network that's similar to Twitter in its user experience, but it exposes all of your data to the people who manage whatever Mastodon server you join. And so instead of sharing it with Twitter, you're sharing it with some random who created a Mastodon server. So there's always some risk in which data you're talking about and with whom are you sharing it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Can you go? Oh, I'm gonna go for it.
Do I care about does deep analysis of metadata mining for social media scare you with large scale implications implying almost doomsday view of zero privacy future? My cynical take is that we're living in a zero privacy present. So I don't have to worry that much about a zero privacy future. I have to worry about new uses of the data that's already available about me. I don't actually worry that much about social media metadata mining because it is relatively hard to get the data. I worry more about data aggregation than about metadata. And when I say data aggregation, I mean that it's possible to purchase inferences about me based on my purchasing behavior, my social media behavior, any other things that are observable, my voter file, et cetera, and then aggregating those into here's what it looks like Libby wants to buy today, or here's how to convince Libby to download TikTok, or here's the type of misinformation campaign that might be effective on her given her attention. Those things worry me more than my individual privacy, or sort of what are the social risks inherent in being able to make inferences about individuals that are so granular and so accurate.
Yeah, you're describing the Cambridge Analytica techniques, right?
Yeah. So Cambridge Analytica was a sort of a firm in the UK who was trying to consult about political campaigns, and they got people to expose their Facebook data by taking a personality quiz, and then they combined that data with other data that you can purchase from data aggregation firms.
Just can you clarify the difference then between that approach and what metadata mining is? I'm not sure I understand that term.
So I guess I'm thinking about mining only from social media, or the metadata, which is like, when was it created, by whom, on what platform? But maybe that's not what the questioner meant. But I think that, so I think I'm with our respondents that my social media data is moderately sensitive, and I'm more worried about a lot of other data about me that's being collected without my consent. Like, what is Zoom going to do with this information that it's gathering about us right now? We don't even know what all the information they're gathering about us is.
Or can IIT use this information?
Wow. Or I'm doing it from my Michigan laptop. What is Michigan going to know? Because I'm working on my Michigan laptop. And we're being recorded. Somebody's going to hear me say we live in a zero privacy present. And that, I mean, my privacy colleagues would be like, you said what? So there are lots of risks.
So one question a little different than what's, I have two, but the first one is, the findings that you had, were any of them, I mean, did you expect everything to be to generate concern, to be predictive of concern about this, or were you surprised?
I was surprised that it fell so neatly into personal characteristics and personal identifiers. I was also surprised that people don't understand that their social media identifier is a key to unlock more information about them in the same way that their driver's license number is. I also was really surprised to see how sensitive people thought their driver's license number was. Like, what do they think somebody's going to do with that information? And then that made me wonder, like, well, what is a person's mental model about these identifiers that they're concerned about? But I think, yeah, that it sorted neatly into characteristics and identifiers was sort of interesting, and then what the order of the particular identifiers was. I also was surprised that when we do look at the demographics, that queer folks were more willing to have their data used than other people. And that made me wonder about whether historically marginalized populations want to be heard or seen. And so we're doing a follow-up study with historically marginalized racial and sexual orientation and gender identity populations to find out whether that was a blip in our survey, like was our sample just too small, or is there some see-me motivation for data sharing in populations that have traditionally been excluded from research?
Wow.
I feel that's a very interesting question. Actually, you mentioned actually people's perception of this sensitivity with actually compare with actually the real sensitivity. How did you see actually this with the current research, like the real perception compared to the real sensitivity?
I mean, I think that I don't think that there's necessarily a ground truth for real sensitivity for some of these data types. In part because the sort of how sensitive it is a driver's license number, for instance, depends on who you are and where you're driving, or something like weight, like the that people said was less sensitive. I think that for people who are overweight or underweight, that might be more sensitive than for people who are not. In part because of the sort of social realities that you face as an underweight or overweight person, that might be different for somebody who falls in sort of typical weight range. I think that I closed my share because I wanted to go back to the paper itself, because I knew there was something else that we said was surprising. There's this idea of contextual integrity, that the context in which the data was generated matters. And that when we remove data from the context of its generation, we impact how sensitive it becomes, in part on where does it go. So my driver's license number, if I were to give that to my son, he's not going to be able to do anything with it. But if I give it to my doctor, I had to give it to my insurance company, they might be able to do something with it. For instance, they might be able to find out whether or not I get in car accidents or do I get tickets, which is something that they probably want to know about when deciding how much to charge me for insurance. And so it's not the driver's license number itself that is really sensitive or not, it's with whom am I sharing it? And have I taken it in the context of driving or in the context of something else? And I think that that is, that it's just sort of, the context is messier than we often make it seem. And part of what I was trying to understand with this project is sort of how closely do we need to stick to the context of social media for people to be willing to share their data? And the answer was, sort of close-ish, like it's got to be about social research. They preferred that to natural research, but that we didn't have to be overly protective or aggressively protective of their identities when we did so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Matt, you had a follow-up or another question.
Yeah, something that I was just thinking about, like, this idea of citizen science and how there are different ways that this works, right? Some are about, it's mass data collection, right? Some in crowdsourced data collection. And when it comes to the ability to tap into that through online means, maybe social media based means, do you think that citizen science could take a hit because of these kinds of reasons, for these kinds of reasons?
I do. I think that especially in watching as Twitter becomes, well, as the use cases for Twitter change, for instance, so we were able to use Twitter to do things like predict health code violations and sort of where they were causing outbreaks in New York City. That like, oh, people who ate or live near this restaurant keep saying that they're having food poisoning. Like maybe we should look into that restaurant. As those conversations move to private spaces like a Discord or a Facebook group, we don't have access to that sort of passive monitoring to make those types of inferences. But maybe we shouldn't have been making those inferences in the first place. So it's hard to, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't, because I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but I do think that we as a community have to decide what's okay and what's not okay, and which types of passive data collection and data use are acceptable. Where something like public health outbreaks, we probably are willing to give up a little bit of our privacy to curb those. But sort of selling me candy bars when I check out at the grocery store is sort of, I'm less interested in letting companies know exactly which candy bar I tend to buy if you catch me at the checkout lane, than I am to sort of let you know that, yes, I ate this type of food and then I got sick, and other people might also get sick if they eat that food. You can see here, I have a little bit of a stuffy nose right now. Sort of, if I had been on Twitter still, I would have talked about that. You would have been able to measure like what are non-COVID viruses and their movement in Washtenaw County, which is where Ann Arbor is. And we were sort of doing some of that sort of passive social media monitoring to get a sense of these types of things. I think that the peony garden thing, that I thought for sure people would be okay with that, and that they definitely weren't. I don't know if any of you use Merlin or eBird or Seek, any of these sort of naturalist apps on your phone that help you identify bird and plant species where you are, that they capture some of your location information so that they can say, like, right now there are a couple of cardinals in my yard that we take pictures of over time to sort of help show where the cardinals are and what they're up to, because we're trying to help them come back in Washtenaw County. But would I want that done passively, or do I want to say explicitly, here's a cardinal at my address at this time, and you're welcome to count that cardinal right now? And I think that Whether we make people explicitly opt into these citizen science projects, or if we passively use data that they're already generating for other purposes, is part of that tension. But I think that when we're able to communicate with people what the social benefit to their minimal risk of their privacy exposure is, that they're okay with it. It's when we don't say anything, or if we are dishonest about the risks and benefits, that we get into trouble.
Thank you. I think we have to stop because Libby has to go to another meeting. Let's thank her in whatever way you want. You could shout out thanks, or you could type it in the chat, or do a thumbs up.
Wave your Zoom hands.
Zoom.
you.
I'll just say thanks so much. And it was great to have you back. I look forward to a physical presentation at some point, I hope.
Yeah.
Soon. Libby, are you sure you're done tweeting? Because I could have sworn I saw something going on in your thread. Really?
I haven't tweeted since before spring break.
It's like a week.
No, it was the last week of March.
Okay, well, 2 weeks. Okay.
Well, so here's something scary. Talk about your zero privacy present. So my spouse still tweets, and my students still tweet, and my staff still tweet. So it doesn't really matter whether or not I tweet. Like,
right. They tag you, and you come up. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they tag me or they talk about me. And I can't have any control over that.
Right. Okay.
So.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's great.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.